Let's talk about the decision to be participating provider with Medicare or non-participating provider with Medicare. Now, this is specifically related to physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech language pathologists. When you're contracting with Medicare, you can elect to be participating or non-participating. The appeal for a lot of providers, if they see non-participating providers, is that if you choose to not accept assignment, you're eligible for up to 115% of the non-participating provider allowed amount. So they also call that the limiting charge. That's the maximum you're allowed to collect. But I'm going to tell you, in reality, although the theory is awesome, the reality is I rarely see clinicians actually take advantage of collecting the full limiting charge, and it usually takes one or two mistakes that wipe out any potential extra profit. So let's talk about the two scenarios, pros and cons. If you elect to be a participating provider, you have instant credibility and trust in the mind of the patient because the words participating provider sound much more safe than non-participating provider. The typical layperson doesn't understand that both require you to be contracted with Medicare, both limit the liability and the exposure on the patient's side. There's really no major difference when it comes to compliance and responsibilities, whether you're PAR or non-PAR. But to the consumer, when you hear that a therapist is participating provider with your plan, immediately you have a level of trust that goes up. Now, when you're participating, you can bill Medicare. You will receive 80% of the allowed amount based on the Medicare participating provider fee schedule, which is a little bit higher than the non-PAR fee schedule. The non-PAR fee schedule is 95% of the participating provider fee schedule. So you have a higher fee schedule. You'll collect 80% from Medicare. That typically goes directly into your bank account through direct deposit. So you're not having to deal with depositing checks. You're not receiving mail. You're not having to make trips to the bank or scanning. It's a quicker, more streamlined approach, and you're pretty much guaranteed that payment. That payment is coming from the federal government. The 20% coinsurance is either the responsibility of the patient or the secondary secondary supplemental plan. Now, the thing with being a participating provider is Medicare will automatically forward that 20% to the supplemental plan. If you're a non-participating provider, Medicare will not auto forward to the secondary. So that means that you're going to have more administrative headaches, burden, expense to submit those claims manually to the secondary payers for if you're choosing to be non-PAR with Medicare. The other element here, so I mentioned the non-PAR allowed amount is 95% of the PAR allowed amount. You're allowed to charge up to 115% of the 95% allowed amount. The problem here is if you're going to be collecting at the time of service, which the typical advice is you should do that. You're going to elect to not accept assignment if you're non-PAR. You reduce the fee schedule to 95%. You also have to usually incur the cost of credit card processing because most Medicare beneficiaries who are paying you out of pocket are going to pay on a credit card. They're going to receive benefits. They're going to receive points. You're going to have to deal with the 2.25%, 2.5% processing fee. You're going to have to think about the administrative time, having somebody process that payment, even if it's just a minute or two, let's say 2 minutes. Over the course of 12 visits, that's 24 minutes of time. That's an additional 2 units of therapy worth of time that you could have been delivering rather than processing payments. So the main concern with being non-PAR, electing not to accept assignment, is if you run into a situation where the patient doesn't pay you at the time of service, then you have to bill the patient, you have to follow up on the patient, you have to collect from the patient. And what happens if the patient just decides not to pay? Unfortunately, we know that in business, there's going to be delinquent accounts, there's going to be bad debt, there are going to be patients that just say, I'm not going to pay you. They're going to receive payment from Medicare because if you elect not to accept assignment, that payment will go to the patient, and then that patient may not pay you. So you lost out, the patient was reimbursed incorrectly, fraudulently, and you're dealing with more problems that run up your administrative cost. So I go back to, by default, the advantages are, if you're participating, you have instant trust. You have the auto crossover, so Medicare sends the claim to the secondary automatically. You have direct deposit, so you're making less trips to the bank, and you have fewer credit card processing fees. Whereas if you choose to be non-PAR, it takes one or two patients that don't pay to completely eliminate any potential profit margin or advantage you would have had. You have the extra administrative burden of having to submit claims manually to the supplemental plan because they don't auto forward. And you're starting with a lower allowed amount on the non-PAR fee schedule. So obviously you have to make this decision for yourself. This is part of your business plan. You have to understand what you're doing. But in my experience over the last 20 years, talking to therapists, talking to private practice owners, I have honestly yet to meet an individual who has done better financially going the non-PAR route.